experience. In the intelligence community, I'm not going to weigh in on that, but he carries it so well. In the intelligence community, as well as Homeland Security. I'm just going to take a brief moment to read a brief bio. Charlie, as many of you know, is the former Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security and spent 47 years at the CIA. You're now with the Chertoff Group. General Michael Hayden, a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, and you had 44 years, is that right? 40 years in the Air Force. Thank you for your service. And John McLaughlin, former Deputy and Acting Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He is now the Distinguished Practitioner-in-Residence at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. You know, in the last panel, we really got our first taste of what the threat looks like now. And if I was going to boil it down, I would say that in the last 10 years, Al-Qaeda no longer looks like a Fortune 500 company with someone like bin Laden as the CEO. It's really splintered and morphed, and we've seen the development of the franchises in Yemen, Somalia, other parts of North Africa. We've heard a lot about Mali and Nigeria. And then we also have the emergence of the lone wolf terrorist. So in many ways, Al-Qaeda has become a movement and a set of ideas. You cannot spend your way or bomb your way to victory. So I want to ask everyone on the panel from their own perspective, and I'll begin with Mike. Do you also see the threat in this way?
I do, and I thought the description this morning was quite good, where we had the main attack, the 9/11 thing, the East Africa embassy bombings, Bojinka, right? And now we've got the lower threshold Al-Qaeda attacks, the one-off Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib and Faisal Shahzad and so on, and then the domestic self-radicalized, and that most of the fight is down here now in the lower two. It's not a law of nature. It doesn't have to stay there. It's not up here because of things we do and are continuing to do. It could go back up there. And one of the other things I think is important to note, that second tier, the lower threshold, the Times Square, the flight from Schiphol, and so on. If you look at the performance, it's not been good. We've been a bit lucky, but they've been a bit unprofessional. They've not been all that skilled. One of the reasons they've not been all that skilled is the great pressure we have on them from that first tier down through the second. Take Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib. He's the underwear guy, Christmas Day, 2009. Al-Qaeda had barely time to vet him, barely time to train him, and they put him aboard that aircraft with a weapon that really did have a low probability of success. And all of that is because if they'd have tried for any higher probability, let's vet him longer, let's train him longer, let's give him a better weapon, we would have detected it. And in fact, we came damn close to detecting it at the level they chose. And so we do have this broad measure of success. Now, implied in your question is we're being very successful against the people coming over the wall with an intent to kill us. Now, how do we talk about the production rate in a year, 2, or 5 of people who be wanting to come in over the wall then to do us harm? And that's a separate debate, and we have not nearly been as successful there.
Charlie, why don't you pick up?
Yeah, I strongly support what General Hayden has said. We've had some other close calls. The 2006 August plot, the aviation plot, thanks to great British intelligence, they drove that plot so that it could be disrupted, and we were a great supporting element in that. And of course, the Hewlett-Packard jet laser, which was where we had a bomb inside. It was a PETN type bomb, which was hard to determine. Thanks to a good ally in Saudi Arabia, as John Brennan told the world, that they provided the intelligence. And I think one of the first things, when it was x-rayed during one of the hubs where one of the bombs was going, It was not even seen in the first X-ray by British authorities. So I think we will continue to see, as you say, the first tier has been deeply damaged and decimated. But we now have a lot of tentacles still alive, still around the world, and occurring in surprising places. Boko Haram down in Nigeria on the 26th of August 2011 bombed the UN compound, which was different. For several years, they had only attacked Nigerian targets, Nigerian government and police targets. What caused them to strike and kill the 9 UN workers in that compound? It was a massive bomb, and Nigerian police stopped 2 more bombs from getting through. What I see over the longer term is continuing efforts. The attacks may be smaller, but I think we have to certainly keep our active defense, which we have. But more importantly, and what General Hayden alluded to, is that intelligence-driven offense, which Admiral McGraven and others applauded the intelligence side of that, which enabled him to do the operation at Abbottabad. But we have a lot of work to do. It's going to take the tentacles are going to stay alive for a long time, and we do have an increasing worry of some radicalized individuals in this country. It's going to be small, but all it takes is one individual to create a rampage like what we saw at Aurora, and we're all back into this again. It would again encourage those cadres around the world, those extremist cadres, to again renew their determination to strike at the West and the United States.
I want to bring John in specifically to talk about the case with Faisal Shahzad. This was the young man in May of 2010 who drove what he believed to be a viable car bomb into Times Square. And I don't say this to minimize what that street vendor did, but the reality is that that plot was a success because he was very much under the radar and got what he thought was an explosive device into Times Square, but we were fortunate in that he didn't have the right recipe for the bomb, and it failed. And he was not on our radar, was he?
No, he wasn't. And that relates to a point I would make at the beginning, Catherine, which is that in the end, intelligence is first and foremost a matter of trying to avert surprise. And I don't think we can think of terrorism as a sort of linear phenomenon where we can measure our success by acquisition or denial of territory, by numbers of people killed, and so forth. It's much more subtle and dynamic than that. So in the Faisal Shahzad case is maybe one of the preeminent examples of what I think they still have, which is the capacity to surprise us. Think of the recent attacks that my colleagues here have referred to. The Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber. The attempt to place a package bomb in a FedEx aircraft. The attempt to place a bomb in Times Square. The idea of surgically implanting a bomb in a person and sending it here. To me, the important thing is we didn't think of any of this. We didn't think of any of that. We were skilled in some cases and lucky in others to prevent it. So if I were them, I'd be sitting around saying, what would surprise these guys now? I think I could probably get 10 of my graduate students to come up with something. I wouldn't do that. That'd be a scary proposition. But our defenses are not airtight yet. That's the first thing. Second thing I would say is that I throw a darker shroud on this perhaps because I meet the definition of an intelligence officer that Bob Gates once gave, which is, intelligence officer is someone who, when they smell flowers, looks around for the coffin. So just professionally, I will always see the darker side of things. So I look at it now and I say, yes, we've had tremendous victories here since 9/11, no question. No question. But you could also say their network has expanded. After 9/11, people like Kofor Black and Hank Crumpton chased them out of Afghanistan. We knew they were going to places like Yemen. We went and beat up on them there. We chased them into the settled areas of Pakistan. But at that point, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula wasn't very much. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb was not, as it is now, assisting rebels in the northern two-thirds of Mali. We've had talk about Al-Shabaab. I know it's on the defensive, but still holds about a third of the southern part of the country at hostage, and so forth. So in a way, their network has expanded and become more complex. And then the final point I'd make, just in summary, and maybe something you want to come back to. A year ago, we all would have said in this forum, looking at the revolutions in the Middle East, whatever you want to call them, that this wasn't working for Al-Qaeda. In fact, if anything, it was a refutation of everything Al-Qaeda had been preaching. Today, I would say if I were assessing winners and losers right at this moment, may change, I would say the loser in all of that is probably Iran, but the winner is potentially Al-Qaeda. They've reversed the pipeline that they used to run in the opposite direction into Iraq. They've got, I assume they have a facilitation network in Syria that they use to take in foreign fighters to Iraq. You know, you turn the pipeline around. Egypt, take Egypt. The prime minister, the new president's just appointed a prime minister who held a position in the old regime and is thought to be thinking about Tantawi as his defense minister. There will be massive disappointment in Egypt when this happens among those who are in Tahrir Square. I could write the Al-Qaeda narrative about this. Now, can they get traction? We don't know. But those are the kinds of fluid, dynamic things we have to keep in mind when we think about the threat.
So we've tried to set the table here by identifying the threat as lower threshold, smaller scale attacks. They may not have the same impact of a 9/11, but they still have an impact on the confidence of the American people. So taking that as our premise, Mike, what do you see as the unique challenges for the NSA in this changing threat picture?
Okay. For NSA, it's followed a trajectory since 9/11, and I was there for the first 4 years after it, and General Alexander, whom you heard at lunch, is there for the 6+ years after that. But it's been a fairly consistent trajectory. Now, I want to be a little cartoonish here, okay? It's going to be overstated. The brush is too wide. The colors are too bright. But fundamentally, there's been a shift in the agency from the content of communication to any technology that will allow it to target bad people in the war on terror. Let me give you an example. NSA became famous for the content of messages. If you look at the Venona transcripts, which was the Rosenberg spy ring here, it's the messages. Right? Beginning in my tenure, for lots of reasons, but one of them the war, we moved in the direction of not content, but metadata, which is everything about a communication except what's being said. You know, the instrument, the location, length of call, who they're calling, and so on. Metadata and geolocation. Right? So where is the instrument? Which I would suggest to you, if you're chasing the behavior of a communications instrument and its location, that is incredibly well suited if your purpose in life is to kill the communicant, not so much to listen. Okay? And there has been a shift in the agency in that direction. And I think John and Charlie will reinforce it with CIA as well. In many ways, we've begun to treat targeting and intelligence as a bit synonymous. And by the way, that's really good. That's been a success. That's enabled us to do everything that's been described here this morning and this afternoon. But we need to understand that's what's happening to us. Maybe one more thought. We talked about the DNI this morning right before lunch and how good an idea and is it succeeding and so on. Fundamentally, the DNI was about strengthening the national intelligence director. Okay? Now, 4 of his biggest organizations are in the Department of Defense. One of them is NSA. And I wouldn't call it schizophrenic or bipolar, but it has 2 personalities. It's the National Security Agency, and it's also a combat support agency. Well, you can pass all the laws you want trying to strengthen the national identity. Let me tell you what that kind of organization becomes after 10 uninterrupted years of combat. That defense identity becomes very, very strong. Okay? That also is a good thing. American teenagers in harm's way, I want that. What we have to remember as we go forward that these things have happened. These kind of identities and emphases have changed, and we have to make adjustments now as we kind of course correct for the world we have in front of us, as opposed perhaps to the world we've had behind us.
I want to pick up on Mike's point and bring in John, because my question is, if what we're seeing with a group like NSA is this shift to targeting intelligence for drones or otherwise, are we doing that and compromising at the same time traditional espionage? And John has just written a piece which you can find on the CNN website, the Security Blog, and just explain to the audience how, in your opinion, you think CIA today has never looked more like its roots in the OSS.
Oh, well, you can get all the details on the blog there, but the key points are that this is the first generation of CIA officers. This is a point Mike has made, too, publicly, since Vietnam, to be socialized, if you will, in war. More so than the Vietnam generation, in the sense that that was sort of geographically, culturally confined. The kind of wars these young officers have been in are much more complex, and they have occurred in a world much more complicated than the Cold War, Vietnam. That's the first thing. Second thing is the agency, in response to 9/11, received a lot of authorities to go out and do bold and aggressive things that they had not been authorized to do before. That brings about a cultural change in an agency. You are more concerned day to day, and I'm sure Mike would agree from his time as director. You're more concerned, you need to be more concerned day to day with issues of life and death. Look at the stars on the wall in the entrance to the agency. There are 103 stars on the wall. Those are officers who die in the line of duty. 1/4 of them, about, have been added since 9/11. It's been a dangerous decade for the CIA. A lot of other ways in which it's changed, and most of this is to the good. The point you make about targeting, I'm going to use Mike's paint can and brush here. Yes, I mean, issues of life and death always take priority over other issues, and therefore I think the capacity to focus, here's the problem. The CIA has to cover the entire globe. You're not excused for anything. Something blows up in East Timor, the president wants to know the next morning everything about it, including where it's going next. Maybe you haven't had enough people to follow East Timor in the kind of detail that's required to answer that question. That's what you struggle with every day. Tunisia would be a good example. There's no question that the focus on the war zones has made it harder to do what the agency calls global coverage, meaning everything else. Now, again, same paintbrush. They do the rest of it pretty well. You basically end up dividing the issues into urgent, important, maintenance, investment. And so you have to maintain coverage of everything that might blow up in the world, because the lesson you take from years there is places like Burma, I mentioned East Timor, Indonesia, Tunisia, which might not be at the top of your radar screen, suddenly turn out to be the riveting focus of national policy. And you've got to be a player on day one. And that's maybe the biggest challenge for the agency. And I think they're doing pretty well at this.
I just have one human interest story. August 2008, Russian invasion of Georgia, tanks heading towards Skin Valley. Then, are they going to Tbilisi or not? Steve Hadley's on the phone to me. What's happening? What's going on? Red switches lighting up. I walk out to my outer office, to my executive assistants, and says, "Get my Georgia guys up here right away." And they get on the phone, and I turn to one of them and says, "We got Georgia guys, right?"
That's great.
But you did.
We did, and they were great.
Yeah.
But they had not broken the threshold of the 7th floor.
One of the things you have to say to agency analysts, I have had analysts come to me and say, you know, I've been working on Albonia. I'm making that up. I've been working on Albonia for 10 years, and no one's paid any attention. And I always say to them, your time will come. And it always does.
So if I was going to summarize, I'd say with the CIA, there's that reflex to, as you have said, run to the sound of the guns. So is that...
And this is not a bad thing.
I'm not saying that's bad. Someone's got to run to the guns. But is that happening in a way that we are not doing the kind of collection that we need to be doing to anticipate the surprise? And Charlie, I'm going to let you pick up on that one.
Well, I think that's a good question, and I do agree with John that the global intelligence balance the ability to do collection and analysis beyond the war zones and places where we have terrorism centered is pretty good. There's been some studies done under the DNI which suggests that we're in better shape than anticipated. But I do have concerns, and I believe Admiral Blair referred to it, or someone this morning, about we don't have quite the seasoned analysts that we once had. I don't know, 55% of CIA personnel have been hired since September the 11th. We used to have people that did Indonesia. I knew a woman who spent her entire CIA career, 26 years. She only worked Indonesia. She spoke the language. She knew every island in the archipelago, and she knew it all. And you could turn to her for absolute certitude that what you have is very authoritative. I think when you look at the Arab Spring and you look at our ability to focus on instability, things that might trigger that instability, do the strategic assessment, and do the strategic warning, something I used to do a lot of and created sometimes a bit of havoc for people like John McLaughlin.
For being
but
right.
We really have, I think, slipped some. I do believe that the DNI recognizes this, Jim Clapper, and I do believe that General Petraeus, who has this huge analytics center called the Directorate of Intelligence, recognizes it. And I believe we're getting better balance and better depth. But I do believe that the Arab Spring, we could have been more effective had we collected and analyzed and broader beyond CT and counterinsurgency.
I want to just pick a follow-up for you, Charlie. If we are, I'm generalizing here, more dark in some areas than we would like to be, what does that mean for Homeland Security?
What it means for Homeland Security is that Homeland Security has really a very major role that is not just border security, not just TSA security, and let me tell you, DHS has phenomenal databases, and I know that Mike Leiter alluded to them this morning, that are absolutely instrumental in the fight against terrorism. But DHS has a broader role in intelligence. It's not going to be operational and investigative like the FBI. The FBI has that role, and no one can ever challenge that. But because al-Qaeda wants to create mass human casualties, it wants to destroy infrastructure and damage the American psyche, DHS has a very important role in trying to prevent dangerous people from crossing our borders. And I think there are imperfections on some of the borders, but in the air borders, we have incredible security. It's also dangerous materials. DHS and others is working with the rest of the government, including defense, on sensors to detect bio and nuclear. And above all, it has this critical infrastructure. And DHS intelligence and DHS Protective Directorate, NPPD, under Rand Beers, has real responsibility long-term to work with the private sectors, because there are 18 of them, and we need to help them in any way we can to eliminate vulnerabilities, detect vulnerabilities, and provide guidance and assistance. So I think what it means for DHS is that it is not going to do great global assessments, but it does have a real role working not only with the federal government, but with state and local, where we have a very rich relationship. It's been continued by my successor, and with the private sector. 85% of our industry is in the private sector, and we have, as Keith Alexander pointed out, work in partnership. So I think it all fits together. Mike Leiter says we have a long way to go in Homeland Security intelligence. He's right. I worked hard to do that. Karen Wagner, my successor, is working hard to improve on it.
One of the things that strikes me just as really a layperson is it just seems to me that the threat can evolve and change more quickly than we are able to adapt to it. Is that a fair assessment?
we're always challenged by that. We've all examined our consciences up here about 9/11, what could we have done, and so on. I think at the end of the day, it's a failure of imagination. It was hard for us to picture evil on that scale, particularly coming against the homeland. There's a case to be made that Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, Christmas on the flight to Detroit. I mean, we're all over Yemen. We think al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is going to do something, but again, our instincts, since this was a franchise, and a franchise had never reached globally, our instincts were to kind of look regionally for what they were doing. So this does remain a challenge for us. As John suggested earlier, what are they thinking next? What's going to surprise these guys?
I want to just add to that. Back in the summer in 2000, we got better intelligence on al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And in 2001, it was intensified. We knew a major attack was coming. And under the leadership of George Tenet and John, we really buttoned up the world. And George Tenet was relentless in getting out messages, warning, assessment, drove Kofor and others, I'm sure, intensely mad at times. We buttoned up everything except the homeland, and we all have pains of what happened that day. Even today, it's very, very vivid about how we buttoned up everything except our homeland, which we should have buttoned up as well.
Let me say something about that, because I actually think about it a little differently. I think we may have, in a sense, have closed the adaptation gap pretty much. If you think about it, over the last decade, the decade has been about adaptation. When you attack a terrorist group, you don't always defeat it. More often than not, you change it. It adapts. And so you've got to be attuned to that and always prepared to adapt. Some of the conversations this morning made me think back to the days immediately after 9/11. We didn't have an Aspen Security Forum. We didn't have a wonderful publication coming out of West Point on counterterrorism. By the way, if you don't read that, it's astonishingly rich in detail and research. We didn't have an FBI that had yet adapted in the brilliant way it has to covering the homeland. I would say after 9/11, we were pretty much blind in the United States in the immediate days after. We didn't have a U.S. military that had yet achieved this sort of brilliant success in understanding and adapting to the battlefield that it has in the last 10 years. So none of that is true today. So we've adapted very well to this enemy over the last decade. Where we are now is having to, and one of the features of this, just to get into the weeds a bit, is the CIA right after 9/11 created something called a red cell. It still exists, and its job was to get into the minds of the terrorists. That is, to think like them, to imagine what their next targets would be. And this was an extraordinarily effective input to national policy. These were extraordinary people. We gathered all of the eccentrics we could find in CIA, and the bar is very high. Put them all in one room, lock the door, slid food under the door. You're not coming out till you figure out what's next. And they were very effective. So I think, not withdrawing my earlier comment about their capacity to surprise us, we've been pretty good at adapting to the war that they created.
Before I move on to the subject which I want to spend a little bit of time on, which is this war of ideas and the changing narrative about terrorism, just in a couple of sentences, I'd like each one of you to get out your crystal ball and predict what you think a successful attack would look like in the next 5 years.
Do you really want us to reveal that?
Yes.
I, myself, and I think a lot of folks like me, I'm chopping carrots or something up in the kitchen on the night before Thanksgiving 2008, watching the hotel in Mumbai burn and seeing the strategic impact that 10 or 12 individuals armed with only automatic weapons and cell phones were able to do against us.
Some period of time.
And that's the one that scares me the most.
I would agree with General Hayden. It's those kinds of very disciplined, small attacks. These were 10 guys who trained and rehearsed for a long time, but they were extremely effective and caught the Indian government deeply by surprise. But simply any type of, one of the things that, as Clark Kent Irvin knows, we spent a couple of days looking at Homeland Security and weapons of mass destruction. One of the phenomena that has sort of surprised us is the lack of a radiation attack using just the isotopes from a medical facility or industrial waste, creating some sort of event, and it could locally do damage and make some areas uninhabitable for a period of time. Why that hasn't occurred? To me, it's those kinds of sudden things that it may not cause mass casualties, it may not damage critical infrastructure, but it will damage the American psyche, and the American public will want to understand what happened and why.
Well, I think there's two things to say. The first thing is that some things we can be sure of, and then some things we can really worry about. I think the things we can be sure of is they will continue trying to do the sort of things that they've tried to do in the last 5 years, the smaller attacks that Charlie and Mike have referred to, although Mike's Mumbai was by no means small. That's certain. They're going to try. And I think it's relatively sure that one of them will get through at some point. Now, what do I mean by a small attack? It won't seem small if they bring it off. There's a school of thought, when I speak publicly, people will say, well, we're not really existentially threatened, so what's the problem? Well, I'll tell you, if that airliner had gone down over Detroit with close to 300 people on it, I don't think that would have been the reaction of the American public. Now, one can get into a discussion about whether we should be more resilient or not. That's a whole other discussion. Of course we should. But those things are going to continue. Big worry that I think, we have trouble imagining these things because we can't prove they're going to happen. We haven't seen them happen. This is the way people felt about terrorism before 9/11. Until you saw that, it didn't crystallize people's understanding of the phenomenon. So it's the WMD issue that I think we have to worry most about. And here you come back to the issue that a number of panelists have referred to in the past, which is we know what we know, but there's what we don't know. So what do we know? 2 data points, 2003, 2006. Small but significant quantities of highly enriched uranium escaped from, we assume, the former Soviet Union across the Georgian border and are detected. Quantity-wise, maybe enough to fill half that glass. Enriched to 89, 90%, with one of the perpetrators saying, I can get more. Okay? Well, the IAEA can document about 15, 20 cases where nothing of that highly enriched quality has got, but 15 or 20 cases of escaped material. That's what we know. I worry about what we don't know. Because, as Mike has pointed out often, in the Cold War, we understood the capabilities of the enemy pretty well, but not so well the intent. Now we understand the intent of these guys pretty well, not so much their capabilities on that score. And their intent, very clearly through fatwa and other public statements, is to carry out that kind of an attack. Leaving aside for the moment that we would all agree that al-Qaeda core is weaker than it once was.
I'm sure this is not a surprise to anyone here, but in the last 3 years we've had more cases of homegrown terrorism in the United States than we had in the first 8 years after 9/11. And the most concerning development in that has been that the target of choice has been the military. Whether it was Fort Hood, whether it was a military recruitment center. So my question to the three of you is, how has the changing nature of our response to the threat affected the narrative about us and about terrorism?
Well, you're right about the military targets. And it's something that probably we could have anticipated, just given the length of the conflict. it's not a compelling argument to stop doing what we're doing, back to the 3 tiers, and you got to keep the pressure on. But it's something I think we need to understand. But let me just kind of season that a little bit differently, Catherine. Actually, Charlie and I were testifying. We were both in government, and we were asked about homegrown threat. And while not minimizing it at all, we pointed out that we as Americans are blessed with a political culture very different than our European allies. This danger is there, and it's never zero. We do have a more welcoming culture. We do have a habit of incorporating immigrants. And that overall approach, that overall arc, has made this less of a problem for us than, frankly, it's been for countries in Western Europe. I mean, look at what happened in Spain, the trains on that day in March. Look at the British and the subway system in the 2006 plot. All British citizens, but of immigrant status.
Yeah, I would just like to add that the Pew Research of the report of 22 May 2007 found that most American Muslims, for example, were middle class, mainstream. We have only a tiny minority, extremely small, who seem to listen to this siren call of the jihad. It hasn't gotten traction in here, in this country, and I don't think it will. I do believe there will be some. We had a spike, particularly in 2008, of homegrown terrorism, but that was because of the Somali issue, and we found dozens of first-generation naturalized Somalis headed off to fight in East Africa on behalf of the Al-Shabaab. The second-generation natural-born Americans have not been as active. We were behind the power curve. I remember meeting at the White House, and Art Cummings was there and saying, we're really scrambling to catch up with the Somali issue. Well, we did catch up with it. But I do believe that ideologically it will take root in some areas in this country, but it's still going to be very small. But that doesn't mean there cannot be what you might call, as you said earlier, Catherine, a real significant attack, or one that the public would certainly consider a very significant attack upon the United States. We just have to keep the 3 tiers going and work it hard. And we have to work counter-radicalization, counter-ideology. And it has to be strong public policy. It's one we shy away from, and we don't like to talk about it because of civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy here in this country. But we do have to address it. I think this administration and future administrations have to be very candid with the American public.
I really don't have anything to add other than to say I think this is an area where we will have trouble knowing, because this is a phenomenon that exists invisibly on the internet. And you just don't know how many people are sitting in front of their screens absorbing the propaganda and what effect it's having on them, allowing for the safeguards that Mike and Charlie have laid out.
To each of you, do you believe that there is what I call a generational divide? This is a digital jihad, and that people who grow up with social networking have an intimacy on the web and identify with each other in a way that older generations do not. And what I'm getting at here, they don't have to have that one-on-one contact to cross that threshold to violence, kind of the mentoring thing. They're able to do it in a virtual way. And if you believe that's the case, Mike, where does NSA fit into all of that?
Well, first of all, there's always been this debate. How powerful are those websites in terms of recruiting and radicalizing? And to be very candid, my second agency, CIA, always seemed to downplay it. They were of the view, certainly early in my time as director, they were of the view that it really is personal contact, that you don't get to the bottom line on the web, that you do need that human being. I suspect that they no longer believe that, and if it were ever true, I don't think it's true now. And as you described, you've got this digital divide, you've got this new generation that can actually get to the bottom line in a purely digital world. That is the problem from hell for the National Security Agency. Right? Let me just begin to tick off a few of the issues. If Keith were here, he would do the same. Number one, so you want to go out and squash these sites that recruit? How many of them are there, and how long is that going to take? The answer is infinite and infinite. I mean, it's just whack-a-mole. There will be a debate from other agencies saying, "Don't leave them up there. We want to see what these websites say. We want to learn where the thinking is, where the philosophies are going." Okay? And then there's believe it or not, no, you ought to believe this. We're all Americans, or mostly Americans in the room. There are non-trivial First Amendment questions about viewing as military targets what the rest of the world might view as free speech. And so this is not an easy one at all for us to grip. And Keith suggested it in his comments over lunch. I mean, he's got more capability than he's got policy. And that's where we are in this question.
I do believe there's a digital divide that certainly I was on vacation last week and my grandchildren helped me with my computer when I ran into problems. There's a huge digital divide. I do believe at one time, and I was part of the group at CIA who said there would have to be face-to-face contact before people truly become radicalized and a believer in global extremist jihad. I think that's changed, and I think CIA probably, Counterterrorism Center would have some differing views on that today, that, you can be mesmerized and can be self-radicalized over the internet. I recall a European country that arrested a couple of extremists, and all they were doing was looking at websites, and from that, they had no real contact with other extremists, but they worked on the internet all the time, and then they started planning to conduct an attack. I think some of that is now more prevalent than what it was earlier.
I'd just say there's the mental part and the physical part. The only thing they need physically these days is a place to train, to actually run at obstacles, to actually learn how to mix the chemicals. They do need that. I don't believe you can do terrorism without a place to train. But up to that point, I think you can do it all. It's that generation they're very intimate on the internet, and I don't know what we can do about that part.
It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it just seems to me that we are out of the interrogation business. Do you agree?
Well, to interrogate, you have to detain.
So we're out of the detention business.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, we have no system by which our government is comfortable detaining someone who is captured out of an internationally recognized theater of conflict. So you grab somebody in Afghanistan, we've got a system. You grab somebody anywhere else, it appears, now, Catherine, I'm not in the meetings, okay, more than 3 years out of government, just based upon performance, looking from the outside, it appears that if you cannot build a case that you can put that detainee after a short period of time into an Article III court in the United States, you're going to have a great deal of difficulty getting the approval to detain them. Now that drives you in the direction of, well, if you can't detain them, let me give you another option.
Which is that we kill them.
Which is
right.
to kill them, mm-hmm. Right? We have made it so legally difficult and so politically dangerous to detain people that we, I think, in fact, have a default option towards kinetic lethal strikes. Which, let me just add, which as, obviously there's goodness to that in taking a terrorist off the battlefield. But if you just want to prick your conscience a little bit, if you're trying to argue this on the very highest moral plane, that sounds a little bit like no quarter.
Right.
And no quarter is not consistent with international law.
And, detentions and interrogations are really crucial. I recall when I was assistant DCI for collection, I poured through every detention report. We did not have a profound understanding of the capacities of Al-Qaeda on September the 11th. By 2003, 2004, 2005, we had a lot, not only from penetrations of Al-Qaeda and clandestine reporting, but from the detention reports. It's Abu Zubaydah, it's KSM, and it's dozens of others. And I've read hundreds and hundreds of KSM reports, and believe me, those reports are extremely accurate, valid, and KSM even talked about the Bojinka plot, which helped us think very clearly in those crisis-ridden days of late July 2006, early 2000 into August 2006, about what was potentially forthcoming in the aviation plot that was disrupted.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a lot left to say other than that I think we're still doing interrogations on the battlefield. In other words, if you're talking about low-level interrogations, yes. I don't think the three of us have really privileged knowledge of precisely what's happening, but looking from the outside, it doesn't appear that we're doing the kind of interrogations that we once did on very senior, knowledgeable terrorists.
So, John, does that create the right conditions for a vacuum in our knowledge of the structure and the changes in these organizations, that we are increasing the chances that we will be blindsided?
Well, you're going to learn about terrorists from 3 or 4 vectors. You're going to learn about them through the work of the NSA. You're going to learn about them through classic human. You've penetrated them, and you have an agent who's telling you things. You're going to learn about them through open source. Increasingly these days, there's serious research being done. And you're going to learn about them through interrogations. What you learn from a person who's in the movement is not just what you learn on the first day, but what you can go back and ask over and over again when you get a piece of information from one of those other sources that looks like a pot shard, and you're trying to figure out, okay, where does this fit in the puzzle? You can go back to a detainee at that point and say, well, where do I put this? How does this fit? What is this telling me? Now, the other phenomenon here is that, as Charlie said, we didn't know a lot about this network and the organization right after 9/11. We knew more than most people think we knew, and we were battle ready, or Hank Crumpton couldn't have had people on the ground in 15 days. But in terms of understanding the intricacies of the network in a fine-grained way, we weren't quite there. It was really through the detainees that we developed that map of the network, where the critical nodes were. Now, maybe one could argue that we know that so well today, it's not as necessary as it once was, but anytime you deny yourself information in the intelligence business, you're opening up a gap.
I have a final question before we're going to open it up for your questions, and I'll begin with John and work down the line. For lack of a better phrase, when is someone going to put on their big boy pants and have that conversation about resiliency? That 100% security is just not possible.
Well,
and how important is that to the Homeland Security debate?
Well, we're all wearing our big boy pants.
Good. Me too.
But, that sort of falls in the category of something that, talking about resiliency, falls in the category, I don't want to dodge this, but it's a policy and leadership issue more than it's an intelligence issue. Again...
do we do a disservice by someone at the policy level not having that discussion? Shouldn't we have it now and not after something's happened?
Yes, and I've heard some political leaders refer to the fact that we may, despite our efforts, someone may get through, a terrorist may succeed, and we cannot fold up and into despair as a result of that. We have to go on with our lives. People say that. I don't know whether we say it often enough, but this may be in the category of very hard to do. Taking apart a terrorist network requires things that intelligence can do and things that intelligence can't do, certainly not alone. We can go out and capture and kill terrorists. We can sometimes help deny their safe haven. Intelligence is not very good at changing the conditions that give rise to the problem. That's a combination of assistance policy, diplomacy, international work, the United Nations, and so forth. So this may fall in that category of things that intelligence can advise our leaders to do. Well, but the reflection on intelligence is this. There is an implication here. If we're not resilient, every time something goes wrong, the roof is going to fall in on the intelligence community, even if it has had 1,000 successes. And when you're talking about success and failure in intelligence, think about the difference between basketball and baseball. If you're playing basketball and you're a foul shooter, you got to hit 90% of your shots or you're failing. If you're in baseball, you can get into the All-Star game with a 300 batting average. Where do you want intelligence to be on that scale? Where can it be? Well, you want it to be over at 90%. And frankly, in the last few years, it's been pretty close. Really, think about it. Pretty close. You can seldom see success in intelligence. I was thinking about this during some of the earlier panels, when people alluded to success and failure. Often intelligence success is when something doesn't happen. an embassy doesn't get blown up because Mike Hayden or Charlie Allen called the ambassador and said, we have information that something's going to happen tomorrow, evacuate the embassy. Or it's woven into the fabric of a successful policy invisibly. The Balkans is a good case in point. Balkans largely had a successful outcome. Intelligence was very instrumental to that. But no one would say that, nor would I care if they did, and that's not the issue. But how did I get on that riff?
You were about to hand it over to Charlie.
Okay.
I agree.
Stop me while you can.
John is doing brilliantly. It is a policy and leadership issue, and it's also, I think, a conditioning of the populace. The British on 7/7/2005, yes, they closed the tube where the explosions occurred. The rest of the tube kept running. The trains ran in and out of London. They didn't stop them. The Gatwick and Heathrow kept running. The buses all ran except the one that had the casualties and the top ripped off. The British are very resilient. Why? They were bombed in the Blitz. They suffered 44,000 dead in the bombing of Britain. They also suffered hundreds of casualties with the IRA. There was a certain degree of determination, and if they couldn't get to work the next day, they didn't stay home. You notice they all walked to work if they had to, or rode their bicycles. I think our country, which has been very insulated by great oceans, has not experienced this and not been conditioned and hardened. It makes it all the more important for Homeland Security intelligence to work with foreign intelligence, as Ambassador Negroponte, I think, pointed out, so that we can have a more synergistic effort in helping not only fend off the attacks, but also harden our vital infrastructure, which is vulnerable to attack. There's no question of that.
Reinforce what John and Charlie said. Remember the layers of threat, big attack, franchise attack, one-off. And if this is what we're doing now, all right, keep that in mind. These lower edge franchise attacks and these one-offs, self-radicalized, less sophisticated, less well-organized, less likely to succeed, less lethal if they do succeed, they're just going to be more numerous. And to use a sports metaphor, they're penalty kicks, all right? And I don't care how good our goalie is, sooner or later this ball is going to go in the back of the net. Okay. We need to be psychically prepared for that as a nation. Now back to this is what we're doing. Having told you what I just told you, what do you want me to do with my arm? I can do that. But you're going to give up privacy, you're going to give up convenience, you're going to give up commerce. I mean, metaphorically, how much more do you want to take off when you go through Dulles, right? Okay? What we are asking for as professionals is our political leaders to say, no, Hayden, right there is where we want it to be. We got the story. We know this is liable to happen. But when it does, we understand the circumstances. We've made an adult value judgment that this is all we want you to do. Let me give you the dark side of our community. That doesn't happen. And we are accused of not doing enough to defend America when Americans feel frightened. And then we're accused of doing too much when they feel safe again. And that's because of the absence of this mature political dialogue.
Okay, I promised, yeah, that's very, very well said. I promised to take your questions. I apologize, I haven't left a lot of time, so we probably have time for maybe 2 or 3, so get your hand up fast, right here in the front. Yeah.
Aaron Fuller. So you mentioned, Charlie Allen, you mentioned the Brits and resiliency. So in a few hours, the Olympics opens in London. If the Brits get through without any kind of a terrorist event in the Olympics, why will that be? Will it be because nobody wants to hit them? Or will it be because there's something different about what the Brits are able to do, whether because of culture or laws that permits them to do a better job?
I don't know that we do a fantastic job globally in an intelligence perspective, but the British have a different form of government. They do not have a Bill of Rights like we have. They have certain authorities that perhaps we would like to have sometimes, but we don't have. They're very experienced. They're extremely veteran. They are led by incredible heads of the intelligence services, both internal and external. And they have a police department where they have a great and total relationship at the constabulary level in every village, every hamlet. We have a federal system of government where it's a little more difficult. We have to work at it a lot harder to share information at state and local. And let me tell you, the police in this country are fantastic. 810,000, and our firemen, 1.2 million. And we have great information sharing that we didn't have 10 years ago. But I expect the British to get through this very effectively. Yes, there's been some shortfalls in getting private guards up to speed, and they had to race in. And in Britain, you always have a strike of some sort, so it's not anything terribly unfamiliar, having been turned around on a Lufthansa airliner on the last approach at Heathrow because suddenly the air controllers went on strike. So I think they'll do very well. But, knock on wood, my heart is with them.
Right here, please.
Thank you, all of you. Jim LeBlanc, Unity Resources Group. I'll keep the question very short. What role do you see the private sector playing in the future with the collection of intelligence?
The collection of
intelligence.
Collection of intelligence.
In collection of intelligence, we look to them to be cooperative. They work with state and local officials. They work with fusion centers. They obviously work with now at the national level. If they see things that bother them, they have a responsibility. They feel they have a responsibility to report. They're the relationship that, and I won't speak for overall intelligence, but DHS has developed writ large with the private sector has been very rich. And as a consequence of private sector reporting, we've put out Homeland intelligence reports.
I've learned a lot about private sector intelligence in the last 3.5 years, and I wish I'd have known the depth and the quality of that work while I was in government. I realize you can't integrate too much, otherwise you create difficulties for the private sector. But I've really been impressed at the quality of work that is done, and it is an art and science that can only be described as intelligence.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for coming. General Hayden, Charlie Allen, John McLaughlin, thank you for your insight, your years of service, and for the honor of sitting here with you this afternoon. Thank you.